legal action. 3 days later, the sheriff's office posted a notice confirming the audit's legitimacy and stating that any interference would be considered obstruction. Karen went quiet. Temporarily. But she wasn't finished. 1 week later, my water shut off. I thought it was a pipe freeze, but when I checked the supply valve, it had been manually closed and zip-tied shut. A note was stapled to the wooden post beside it. Unregulated private usage in violation of community standards. Rectify immediately. It wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. I turned it back on, took a picture, sent it to Bill. He didn't reply, but the next day, Darren showed up in a reflective vest and took pictures of my plumbing. I told him if he didn't leave my property in 30 seconds, I'd hose him down with the water he was so concerned about. He left. It was quiet again. Too quiet. Until the night I got a knock at the door around 10. It was Jim, holding a flashlight and a grin. "You need to come see this," he said. I followed him down the hill, past the curve near the community trail. We stopped at the new gravel path behind Karen's house. The one she insisted was for community use but had always been suspiciously manicured. Someone had dug up part of it. Not vandalized. Excavated. And beneath the gravel, tucked inside a locked irrigation box that didn't look very old, was a bundle of sealed documents wrapped in plastic. Jim found them while doing a night walk with his dog. We opened them right there under the moonlight. HOA invoices. Private. The day of the HOA election dawned quiet and gray, the kind of mountain morning where clouds settle low like they're eavesdropping, and the pine trees lean in close like they know something's about to break. The clubhouse had never seen so many trucks and SUVs jammed into its gravel lot, people parking halfway up embankments and hiking down in boots, thermoses in hand, like they were headed for a campfire showdown instead of a ballot box. The air buzzed with the kind of tension that only builds when neighbors stop being neighborly and start keeping receipts, literal ones. Karen arrived first, wearing a blazer 2 sizes too formal and sunglasses big enough to cover most of her face. She smiled like a queen prepared to forgive the peasantry, offered muffins wrapped in plastic to anyone who walked past, and stood by the door shaking hands like she was running for state senate. Her husband, a pale man named Dennis who rarely spoke above a mutter, trailed behind her carrying a clipboard and a cooler, looking more like a hostage than a campaign manager. Meanwhile, Marla and Jim were inside setting up the vote table with Bill and the sheriff's deputy, who'd now become a regular fixture at community events not for security, but for fairness. The county had agreed to oversee the election after Marla presented documentation of past irregularities, including missing ballots and technical errors, suspiciously always in Karen's favor. There would be paper ballots this time. Verified ID. 1 vote per household. No proxies. No exceptions. I sat in the back row, sipping coffee and watching it all unfold like a man who'd been in the trenches too long to flinch anymore. Darren tried to approach me once, probably hoping to offer a truce or a thin smile, but one glance and he veered off, pretending to check the thermostat. The vote itself went quickly. People lined up. They dropped their ballots into a locked box that clunked every time like a little drumbeat of justice. Karen tried to make a speech before the count, but Bill shut her down, reminding everyone that campaign statements had ended the night before. She sat stiffly, twisting her wedding ring, eyes darting around the room as if someone might still rise to defend her. No one did. Even her most loyal backers, the newer couples she'd lured in with talk of property value optimization, sat silently, casting glances at each other like they were waking from a long, strange dream. And then came the count. It took 30 minutes, during which Karen paced the back of the room, whispering to Dennis, typing furiously on her phone. When Bill finally stood up and read the results, it felt like time slowed. Karen had lost. Not by a little. By a landslide. 2 votes out of 50 in her favor. One was her own. The other was, presumably, Dennis. The room didn't cheer. It didn't need to. The silence spoke louder than any applause could. Karen stood frozen, blinking rapidly, then stammered something about corruption. bias, and voter manipulation. Bill simply held up the audit letter from the county clerk's office confirming everything had been conducted legally, transparently, and without error. She grabbed her purse, turned on her heel, and stormed out without saying another word. The door didn't slam, but it might as well have. After that, people drifted out slowly, smiling quietly, as if a long sickness had lifted. Marla hugged me. Jim clapped me on the back. Even Bill, sheepish and relieved, pulled me aside and thanked me for not setting the clubhouse on fire during the worst of it. I told him he still owed me a sandwich. He said he'd buy me 3. For the first time in months, the mountain felt like a neighborhood again. But Karen wasn't done. Not completely. That evening, a moving truck pulled up to her cabin. Not a full one, just a short bed rental, like she was clearing out the valuable stuff first. I watched from my porch as she loaded in boxes, Dennis moving slower than a man should who wasn't chained to the process. She glanced up once, saw me watching, and froze. I raised my mug in salute. She didn't wave back. Just turned and disappeared into the shadows of her now former kingdom. A week passed with no flyers, no pink tags, no Darren. The mountain healed fast. People started waving again. Dogs barked less. Kids played near the trails without parents hovering nervously. I restacked my woodpile. Clean, honest logs this time. No ants. No trick. Just pine and birch, cut straight, dried smooth. But I wasn't done either. One afternoon, I took a drive down to town and picked up a fresh load of firewood. Extra clean, kiln-dried, perfectly split. I stacked it neatly in the bed of my truck, drove up the winding road past Karen's cabin, and parked just outside her gate. She hadn't moved yet. The house was still half full. A for sale sign leaned against the porch post, its letters half obscured by a spiderweb. I walked up, set the new stack of logs down carefully beside her driveway, and taped a note to the top. It said, simply, "All you ever had to do was ask." Then I got in my truck, drove back down the hill, and didn't look back. Word got around, of course. It always does. Some said she never opened the note. Others said she burned the logs out of spite. One neighbor swore they saw Dennis loading them quietly into their garage after dark, like they were contraband. I didn't care either way. The message was for me more than her. A final act. A period at the end of a very long, very absurd sentence. The next HOA meeting was the first in years that ended in under an hour. No complaints. No raised voices. No accusations. Just a few lawn concerns, a discussion about fixing the trailhead sign, and a vote to replace the clubhouse coffee pot. It passed unanimously. Bill bought donut. People smiled. I left early, walked home through the woods, past the trees that had watched it all. The wind was quiet that evening, the mountains soft beneath my boot. My firewood stacked perfectly in rows, not because I was afraid of theft anymore, but because I liked the way it looked, clean, solid, honest. And as I sat on my porch with a mug of coffee and watched the sun sink behind the ridge, I thought about all of it. The ants, the pink tags, the secret trails and buried invoices. And I laughed. Not bitter. Not angry. Just tired. Satisfied. Free. Because sometimes justice doesn't come from a courtroom or a badge. Sometimes it comes from a stack of firewood, carefully placed, with a note no one expects. And a mountain that remembers exactly who stood tall when the whole thing nearly burned down. It would have been easy to think it was over, to believe that once Karen's campaign collapsed and the audit began, the mountain would simply return to its peaceful rhythm, a place where firewood stayed where it was stacked, bylaws didn't come with threats, and no one tried to sneak zoning policy into the community barbecue. For a few weeks it really did seem like that. Birds returned to chirping instead of being chased off by Karen's ultrasonic pest emitters, neighbors stopped side-eyeing each other at mailbox runs, and for the first time in months, the HOA message board was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt like fresh snow, clean, soft, and temporary. Then came the postcard. It arrived in my mailbox folded in half, postmarked from out of state, the kind of cheap promotional stock you'd expect from a real estate seminar or a discount oil change. On the front was a photo of a smiling couple standing in front of a lake cabin that looked suspiciously familiar, and underneath it, in looping cursive, the words, "Coming soon, Crystal Pines, a shared vision of modern mountain living." I didn't understand at first. I thought maybe it was junk mail or someone's bad idea for a resort, but the more I looked at the photo, the more things started to click. The house in the background was Karen's. Not a copy. Not a coincidence. The same porch. The same window box she once fined someone for copying. I flipped the card over. Small print. Lots of vague marketing language. A lifestyle collective, cooperative recreation infrastructure, revitalizing underused zones. But one sentence stood out. Developed in partnership with previous board members of Ridge Valley HOA. I drove straight to Marla's. She already had the card in hand and a folder open on the table, labeled Crystal Pines in bold marker. Jim was on the phone with the county planning office, his voice sharp and controlled. Turns out Karen hadn't left the mountain entirely. She'd shifted strategy. After her loss, she transferred her property's deed to a shell company she had quietly registered months ago, Crystal Pines Development Group. She was rebranding, pivoting, trying to sell her property and the neighboring undeveloped lots she'd slowly acquired as the nucleus of a new kind of community, one not governed by the existing HOA but designed from scratch with her own rules, her own committees, and, presumably, her own Firewood code enforcement squads. It was like watching someone lose a chess game, flip the board, and start selling custom-made pieces from the gift shop. At first, we weren't sure how serious it was. Karen had ideas before. Most of them crashed into reality before they ever left the printer. But this time, she had investors. Real ones. The LLC filings listed two names. Karen H. Carlisle and a developer from out of state who had once been cited for illegal short-term rentals in another mountain town. It wasn't just a scam. It was a plan. And worse, it was gaining traction. A few cabins went up for sale suddenly, quietly. Rumors began to trickle in, some longtime residents getting generous offers to relocate, cash above market, no questions asked. Then came the surveyors. Two men with clipboards and fluorescent vests were spotted walking the trails behind Karen's property, measuring slope and runoff and soil stability. I caught them near the ridge trail and asked what they were doing. They claimed they were hired for a recreational infrastructure feasibility assessment, which is the kind of phrase that sounds like it was cooked up in a boardroom designed to sound boring so no one asks too many questions. I asked if they were working for Karen. They smiled and said they weren't allowed to say. I told them they were on private land. They packed up quickly. That week, the HOA held another meeting. Packed again, this time not for elections or speeches but for defense. Marla laid out everything. The land transfers, the LLC filings, the investor links, the false advertising, and how Karen's new project was being branded as a modern mountain community that just happened to overlap with part of ours. Legally, she couldn't touch our land, but she was banking on confusion, on new buyers not understanding which bylaws governed which cabins, or who maintained which trails. It was a shell game, and she was already 3 moves in. Jim suggested we file a formal complaint with the county zoning board, and we did. We also started flyering, not glossy cards like Karen, but straight facts, printouts with maps showing real HOA boundaries, proof of land ownership, and reminders that the mountain was not for sale in slices. People rallied. The potluck crew turned into a volunteer task force. We built a website. A retired teacher made a documentary slideshow about the history of Ridge Valley and why it wasn't for flipping. It was corny and it worked. But Karen wasn't just relying on charm anymore. She was dangling money. And it started working. 3 cabins sold. Then a 4th. All to buyers who claimed they weren't sure if they were in the HOA or Crystal Pines. One even argued with Bill at the community center, insisting their welcome packet said they could paint their house purple and use drones to deliver packages. The packet was printed by Karen's company. It included fake rules.